The bidding had already reached $40 when the man on the grey horse finally rode into Harwick. Nobody noticed him at first. The crowd was too busy watching Temperance Lyle stand on the back of a flatbed wagon, in the middle of a November wind, holding her daughter against her chest, like the child might be snatched away by the cold itself. Which, in a manner of speaking, was exactly what was happening. Temperance's husband, Elias Lyle, had died 11 weeks earlier, kicked in the chest by a mule he'd owned for 9 years without incident. The irony of it was the kind that didn't make anyone laugh. He'd left behind a quarter section of land, a leaky root cellar, $43 in debt to a man named Pike, and a daughter not yet old enough to walk. Pike was the one running the auction. He stood beside the wagon in a brown coat that didn't fit him right in the shoulders, a ledger book tucked under one arm, his voice carrying across the frost-hardened mud of Harwick's main street with the ease of a man who'd done this before. Not this exact thing, maybe, but things like it. $40 and the use of her hands through spring thaw, he called out. That's the offer on the table. The men watching shifted their weight from boot to boot. A few of them had their arms crossed, a few had their hats pulled down. None of them looked directly at Temperance, which told her everything she needed to know about how they thought of this. She'd known most of these men for 3 years. Some of them had sat at her table and eaten her bread. One of them had helped Elias roof the barn the summer before last. Not one of them had made her a decent offer. There had been 2 bids before this one. The first from a farmer named Boggs, who wanted someone to cook and clean through the winter in exchange for a bed in the outbuilding. The second from a man passing through on his way to somewhere else, who'd looked at Temperance with the particular kind of interest that made her stomach clench, and offered $35 and a place near the stove. She'd said no to both. Pike had let her, barely, because the debt wasn't yet satisfied, and he needed a buyer, not a scandal. $40 from a man named Culver, who ran the grain operation east of town, and who had a wife already, was the current offer. Culver wanted a cook and a laundress and someone to help with his wife through a difficult confinement. He'd made it clear the arrangement would be strictly practical. He'd also made it clear in a quieter voice, and to Pike alone, that he'd want the baby kept separate, boarded with one of the church women. Temperance had heard it anyway. She held her daughter tighter. The baby, 8 months old and named Birdie, because of the sounds she made when she was hungry, had gone very still against her mother's chest. She could feel the cold. Babies always could. 42, someone called from the back of the crowd. Temperance looked up. She'd expected Culver to push back. Instead, it was a voice she didn't recognize. She couldn't see who'd said it, because there were 12 men between her and the edge of the crowd, and one of them was Dalt Gruber, who was built like a grain silo and stood right in her sight line. Pike squinted. 42 from Voss, said the voice. 42. There was a ripple through the crowd. Not surprise exactly, more like the particular kind of discomfort that spreads when someone enters a room who doesn't usually enter rooms. Dalt Gruber stepped sideways. The man on the grey horse had not dismounted. He sat easy in the saddle like he had no intention of staying long, one hand resting on the pommel, the other loose at his side. He was large in the way that made other large men reconsider their posture. Dark coat, work-worn, a beard that had gone longer than intended, a rifle in the scabbard at his knee, eyes that were doing a quiet, methodical inventory of the crowd, and then the wagon, and then Temperance, not the way men had been looking at her all morning, not assessing what use she might be, but the way a person looks at a situation they are trying to understand before they say anything about it. His name was Voss. That was all Temperance knew. She'd heard it once, from the woman who ran the dry goods, mentioned in passing. Lives up past the Callaway Ridge, keeps to himself, trades furs in the fall. She'd formed no particular picture of him from that description. The man in front of her bore no resemblance to any picture she might have formed anyway. $42? Pike repeated, writing it down in his ledger with the air of a man performing a legal ceremony. And the terms? Voss looked at him. Same as his. He nodded toward Culver without looking at Culver, minus the part about the baby. A very short silence. The child comes with the mother, Voss said. Not loud, not aggressive. Just said it, the way you'd state something that had already been decided. Culver cleared his throat. 45. Voss let a breath out through his nose. 50. Now just a moment, Culver began. $50. Voss said again, same volume, same tone, and there was something in it that made the conversation feel like it had already ended. Culver looked at his boots. He looked at Pike. He did a quiet calculation behind his eyes that had nothing to do with money. 50, Pike confirmed. He wrote it down. He looked at Culver with his eyebrows raised. Culver shook his head once and stepped back into the crowd. Pike turned to Temperance with the expression of a man who had fulfilled his professional obligations and was washing his hands of the rest of it. Settled, then. Temperance looked at the man on the grey horse. He was already looking at her. Not studying her, just looking, waiting to see what she would do. She had 47 cents and a baby and the clothes on her back. She had no particular reason to trust this man, except that he had not looked away when she looked back, and there was something in that, she thought. Something that was at least not. Nothing. She climbed down off the wagon. He didn't speak much on the ride north. The grey horse was named something she didn't catch because he said it only once, quietly, while he was adjusting the saddlebag to make room for her to hold Birdie more comfortably. He rode ahead and she rode behind. On a brown mare he'd brought along without explanation, as if he'd anticipated she might need one. The road climbed, the trees thickened, the sound of Harwick fell away behind them in stages. First the voices, then the dogs, then the faint smell of chimney smoke, until there was nothing around them but the creak of leather and the mare's breathing, and the occasional sound of something moving in the timber along the ridge. Birdie slept. Temperance watched the back of the man's shoulders and tried to take inventory of what she knew. She knew he lived past the Callaway Ridge, which she could now see above them, a long grey spine of rock cutting across the pale sky. She knew he'd paid $50 for her, which was more than she was worth, to anyone in Harwick, practically speaking, and certainly more than Pike's debt had required. She'd done the arithmetic, and the number was closer to 38, which meant he'd overpaid. She didn't know what to make of that. She knew he'd said the baby came with the mother, like it wasn't a point of negotiation, and that it had not, in the end, been negotiated. That was all she knew. The cabin came into view in the late afternoon, settled into the north slope of the ridge like it had grown there. It was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said what she'd expected. It was solid. That was the first word for it. Built from timber that had been taken seriously, a stone chimney, a woodpile stacked so high and straight against the east wall that it looked almost architectural, a small barn, not large, but tight. 2 dogs emerged from behind it when they heard the horses, one grey and one the colour of pine bark, and came to the fence without barking. Voss dismounted. He came and took Birdie from her without asking, not in a way that felt like taking, but in a way that felt like heed. Noticed her arms were tired and thought it would be practical to do something about it. He held the baby in the crook of his left arm with the practiced ease of someone who had held babies before. And then he looked mildly surprised at himself, as if he'd forgotten. That was something he knew how to do. Birdie looked up at him with the unflinching attention of a small person who has not yet learned to pretend not to stare. He looked back at her. Something crossed his face that he didn't put into words. He handed her back to Temperance and went to put up the horses. The inside of the cabin was clean in the way that things get clean when a person who has no one watching them still keeps things in order, which is to say, it was clean for real reasons, not performed reasons. There was a table, 2 chairs, a cot near the fire, and a larger bed along the back wall, partitioned off by a curtain of dark wool. A cast-iron stove that was better than anything she'd cooked on in 3 years, shelves, dried things hanging from the rafters, a rifle above the door, and a skinning knife on the table, handle toward the room, which told her something about how he thought of safety. There was also, in the corner nearest the stove, a low wooden box lined with something soft. Rabbit pelts, she thought. That was exactly the right size for a small baby to sleep in. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. He came in through the door behind her, stamping the mud from his boots. "Was there a child here before?" she asked. A pause. "No." She looked at the box again. Someone had sanded the inside edges smooth. "I built it yesterday," he said. He went to the stove and began building up the fire, and didn't look at her while he said it, which she understood to mean he wasn't going to explain further. She thought about pressing him on it, and then she thought about the fact that he had ridden down off a mountain in November to pay $50 for a woman and a baby he didn't know, and she thought maybe some things didn't need more explaining than they'd already been given. She put Birdie in the box. Birdie made a small sound of consideration and then closed her eyes. The first week was careful. They moved around each other in the cabin with the courtesy of strangers, on a narrow trail, each giving way, each watching where they put their feet. He cooked the first 2 nights. Simple things, stew and fried bread. And she watched how he moved in the kitchen, which was precise and without waste. And then the 3rd night she took it over, without either of them making a declaration about it. He accepted this without comment. She took it as its own kind of welcome. He worked from before light until the dark came, full and hard. And he came inside, smelling of cold and pine and hard work. And he ate what she made and washed his own dishes and sat near the fire with a book. Or sometimes just his thoughts, and he was quiet in the way that was not uncomfortable. The way that meant he wasn't waiting for her to fill it. Birdie was useful in this, actually. Babies fill silences in ways that don't feel like filling, because no one feels obligated to respond to a baby's noises, but the noises give the room something alive to hold on to. Voss had a way of glancing over at Birdie when she made sounds. Not always, not obviously, just sometimes, that Temperance noticed, and chose not to comment on. On the 5th day, she found him outside at dusk, crouched near the fence, talking in a low voice to the grey dog, not saying anything in particular, just talking. The dog had its chin on his knee. She watched from the doorway for a moment, and then went back inside. On the 7th day, she asked him why. He was splitting kindling, which he did every morning regardless of how much was already stacked, in the way that some people have a task they do when they need to think. "Why what?" he said. "Why did you come down?" He set the axe against the block. He looked at the woodpile for a while. "Pike's done it before," he said finally. 2 years ago there was a woman. Things didn't go well for her." She waited. "I heard about this one 3 days before." He picked up the axe again. "I should have come sooner." She thought about that. She thought about him, riding down the ridge in the November cold. 3 days after hearing, which meant he hadn't come immediately, but he had come. And the fact that it had taken him 3 days was not, she thought, because he'd been weighing whether to come, but because he'd been weighing how. She went back inside and stood at the stove for a while with her hands on the iron, not cold anymore, just thinking. It was in the 3rd week that the trouble came back down the mountain to find them. She heard the horses before she saw them. 2 sets of hooves on the frozen ground, coming fast up the north track. She went to the window. 2 men, one of them Culver's hired hand, a narrow man called Renner she recognized from town, and one she didn't know. Both of them had the look of men who had been sent to do something they'd been told was simple. Voss was behind the barn. She didn't call out. She went to the shelf where the 2nd rifle was kept. He had showed her this on the 2nd day, not with instruction, just pointed at it and looked at her until she nodded. And she took it down and checked it and went to stand near the door. The men pulled up in the yard. "We're looking for the Lyle woman," Renner said. He was talking to the door, Not yet aware she was behind it, she opened it. Renner looked at the rifle. He adjusted his expression. "Mr. Culver says there was a problem with the sale," he said. "Says Pike didn't have the proper authority, and the terms aren't legally binding."
"Pike had the authority,"
said a voice behind them. Both men turned. Voss had come around the corner of the barn. He had his rifle in his hand, not raised, just carried in the manner of a man who had brought it along because it seemed relevant. He walked toward them at the same pace he walked everywhere, which was not hurried and was not slow, and gave the impression of a man who had decided where he was going and had no concerns about whether he'd arrive. He stopped at the fence. "The debt's been satisfied," he said. "I have the receipt. Mr. Culver believes. I know what Culver believes." Voss looked at Renner in the particular way he looked at things he had already assessed and come to a conclusion about. "You can tell him the matter's settled, or I can tell him myself. Either way, same answer." Renner looked at the other man. The other man had stopped doing the calculation he'd started when they rode up, and was now very specifically not looking at the rifle in Voss's hand. "We'll pass along the message," Renner said. They left. Temperance watched them go from the doorway. When they were gone, she lowered the rifle, which she hadn't raised, but it was a relief to lower it. She became aware that Voss was standing a few feet away, having come to stand near the door without her quite noticing when. He was watching the track where the horses had gone. "They won't come back," he said. She thought he was probably right. She also thought that if they did come back, she was not going to be standing empty-handed in the doorway, and she thought that was also probably something he understood. He looked at her then, at the rifle in her hands. Something moved through his expression. Not surprised, more like settling, the way a foundation settles when the weight above it has been properly accounted for. He went inside. She followed. There is a moment in the getting used to another person that is not dramatic. It is not a confession or a declaration. It is quieter than that, and because it is quiet, it is easy to miss. She missed it, actually. Or rather, she noticed it only afterward, the way you sometimes only notice a sound after it has stopped. It was an evening in the 4th week, deep into December, the cold outside the kind that makes the windows creak. Birdie was in her box, not sleeping, but quiet, watching the shadows the firelight made on the ceiling with the intense philosophical focus that babies bring to things adults have stopped noticing. Voss was at the table with his book. Temperance was mending. A tear in the knee of his work trousers that she'd found draped over the chair, mending it without asking, because it needed mending, the same reason he'd built the fire back up that afternoon without being asked. She looked up from the stitching and found him watching her, not studying, not assessing, just watching, the way you watch something that you've gotten used to being there and have started, without making a decision about it, to depend on. He looked back at his book when she looked up. She looked back at her stitching. Birdie made a small sound. Both of them looked over. Birdie had found her own foot and was considering it with great seriousness. Voss made a sound that was nearly, not quite, but nearly, a laugh. Temperance did not comment on this either, but she thought about it for a long time later, when the fire had gone to coals, and the cabin was dark and quiet, and full of the sounds of people sleeping in the same space, which are different from the sounds of a person sleeping alone in ways that are hard to explain but unmistakable. She thought about the fact that she was not afraid here. She had been afraid for so long, through the last months of Elias's illness, through the 11 weeks after, through the morning on that wagon, that she had stopped noticing the fear the way you stop noticing a sound that's always there, and now it was gone and she could hear the difference. She did not know yet what to call what was here instead. She found out in January. She had gone out before light to check on the animals. She'd taken on this particular task. Somewhere in the 2nd week, not by arrangement, but by the logic of who was awake first, and she was coming back across the yard in the dark, her breath visible in the cold when she slipped on a patch of ice under the snow and went down hard. She was up before she'd fully registered falling, already assessing. Ankle fine, wrist fine, nothing broken, and she turned and Voss was in the doorway. He'd heard, apparently, or felt, she didn't know. Some people were like that in the night. His shirt was untucked, and he was barefoot in the cold, and he had covered the distance from the door to where she was standing in a time that did not entirely make sense. He looked at her. He looked at her hands, which she'd put out to catch herself, and which were red with coal. He took both of her hands in both of his. He had large hands, and they were warm. She didn't know how they could be that warm in January, but they were, and he held her hands inside of his like something that needed keeping. And he looked at them, checking, making sure, and then he looked up at her. They were very close. The cold was everywhere except where he was and where his hands were, she said. "I'm all right," he said. "I know." He did not let go of her hands, and there in the dark in the yard, in January in the cold, she understood what she hadn't been able to name. It was so simple that she felt slightly embarrassed it had taken her this long. It was the particular warmth of being known by another person, not known completely. They barely knew each other, but known enough, seen enough, held like something worth holding. She was all right. He knew it. He held on anyway. Winter does not end in the mountains, the way it ends in the valley. It retreats slowly, one grudging degree at a time, and there are days in March that look like February, and days in April that look like March, and you have to watch for it, the particular quality of light, the sound the creeks make when the ice in them is beginning to shift. Voss could hear it, she learned. He'd stop whatever he was doing and tilt his head, like a man listening for something he'd been waiting for. She started watching for it, too. Spring came the way things come when you've been waiting for them with the right kind of attention. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, each day a little more itself. She was in the garden when he came to tell her. She'd found a patch of south-facing earth near the cabin wall that might grow something given the chance, and she'd been turning it over with the spade, Birdie propped nearby against a sack of seed corn, watching with great interest. He came and stood beside her and looked at the turned earth. "That'll grow," he said. "I know," she said. He crouched down and looked at Birdie, who immediately put her arms up, which she had started doing with him recently, this automatic reaching, and he picked her up. He was very practiced at this now. He had no memory of becoming practiced at it. It had simply happened in the way things happen when you do them every day, without thinking about whether you're doing them. Birdie grabbed his beard with both hands. He went very still, with the careful stillness of a large person being grabbed by a small one. Temperance leaned on the spade and watched. "She does that," Temperance said. "I've noticed," he said. Birdie seemed satisfied with her examination. She let go and leaned back to look at him from a greater distance, which was the closest to perspective that an almost one-year-old can manage. He said, without looking at Temperance, "I'd like you to stay," she said. "I'd like to stay." He did look at her then. The light was the particular light of a mountain morning, when the cold has finally, genuinely broken, clear and clean, and carrying within it the faint smell of mud and running water, and green things starting. She had not thought on that wagon in November that she was at the beginning of something. She had thought only that she was trying to survive to the middle. But here was the morning. Here was the man, holding her daughter. Here was the turned earth and the south-facing wall, and the long mountain spring stretching out ahead of them, like an answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. She picked up the spade. She had work to do.